I'm Dmitry Farber from Manhattan Prep. Welcome to our session today on getting from 700 to 750. A lofty goal. Maybe not everyone's at 700 right now, and that's okay, but we're trying to figure out what that difference looks like, what it looks like to get those really high up scores. So love to hear from everyone in the chat. Tell me first off, where in the world you are. Where are you joining us from? Um, and I would love to know a little bit about your GMAT experience too. Are you just getting started? Have you taken the GMAT before? So tell us a little bit about yourself in the chat. I'm calling in from San Diego. I've been working for Manhattan Prep since 2009. Been teaching the GMAT and GRE full time. Love to hear what everyone else is up to. Okay. Got some folks joining from India. All right, I already got a 680 score on the books. Okay. Uzbekistan. Nice. Okay. Aiming for 750. Okay. Okay, already at a 740. All right, some of you are not messing around. Okay. Chicago. Okay, taking in 2 months. Great. Yeah, keep them coming. Just kind of curious, what people's stories are so far. And that helps me to shape what we talk about. If everyone here tells me, I'm already getting this tremendously high score, then that's going to be different from everyone who goes, oh, what's the GMAT about? Tell me about this, right? So it sounds like we have some people with some experience. If you're brand new to this, that's fine too. We're going to talk primarily about how this test works and how to study. Um, I figured that today we don't need to focus as much on doing problems. This is something I often do in workshops is do problems. And if you look at my other workshops on YouTube, etc., you'll see plenty where I go through problems. But today I want to make sure to make some progress on this idea of what the test wants from us, how many questions we can miss, and how we study with those things in mind. And so that's more of my emphasis than anything else. Um, okay, so let's look at a few things. I want to talk briefly about how the test is scored. If you've seen my other workshop on the difference between 700 and 750, I cover a little bit of the same material because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. But then I'll address the specific question that we have today of what do I need to get a 750 and how many can I miss? Okay. Actually scored a 750 a few weeks ago, but plan to retake. Well, interesting. If you uh, if you scored a 750 and you got your enhanced score report, maybe you can tell us how many you can miss because you just did it. All right, great. Well, let's pull this thing up. Okay, so again, I'm Dmitry. I teach for Manhattan Prep. I've taken the real GMAT a few times now. Most recent score was a 780, and so let's look at what we can do to get you up here. We've done this already. Okay, so let's skip this. So first off, what is this test doing? The test is basically adjusting your score as you go. And this is why it's so confusing trying to figure out how many questions we can miss because not all questions are created equal. So if you've seen this before, let everyone else have a moment. But these are two trajectories of students and showing which questions are getting right and wrong. Curious what you think, which of these students gets a higher score? Student one or student two? I see folks seeing student two. Yeah, I mean, student one might feel a little wounded about that because student one did some really hard problems. And student one looks like a lot of students that I work with. Here's what they tell me: they see some problem. And maybe you can relate to this if you have a quantitative background, especially. You're doing your math section, you get to a hard problem, but you say, I know how to do this. I can do this. I can get this right. And so we do it, and we get it right. But what are we doing? We're falling behind. We're digging ourselves into a hole. And then we end up crashing later on. One student kind of indignantly bothered me. I saw a problem where they had spent 8 minutes. And I said, oh, you spent 8 minutes. And they said, but I got it right. To which I said, I don't care. I don't care if you got it right because we can't afford to spend 8 minutes on one problem unless we are superhumanly fast elsewhere on the test. And why would we be? Um, so the shortest way to think about this is that where you end up, that little purple dot that we have at the end of these charts, that's actually what you get as a score in your section. So it's not about flying as high as possible. It's about getting rich slow and steadily building up that progress of higher score. Don't get me wrong. If you can be like student one for the first half and continue that way, well, then, hey, that's the path to greatness for sure. But it only works if it's sustainable. It's like if you start a race and you're sprinting as fast as possible. That's lovely if you can do that for the entire race. If you're then going to be walking later on, then it's not so lovely. So we want to make sure that we're doing something sustainable. So to get a 750, we do have to hit a pretty high level and hold it there. Maybe student two isn't getting a 750, right? But we have to make sure that we're doing this without falling behind, without crashing, and without over investing on problems that may not even count. One really important thing to be aware of on the GMAT is that not all the questions count. And I mean this in two ways, actually. Um, there's one way that I think a lot of people know, and one way that not everyone realizes. So one way that not all your questions count is that several of the questions in each section are experimental, meaning that they are not part of your test at all. They're only being used to develop future questions. So in your quant section and in your verbal section, you will see questions that are just a zero. They don't hurt your score. They don't help your score, even if you get them right. So what does this mean? I might spend that 8 minutes on that question and be very proud of myself that I got it. And not only does it not, uh, you know, turn out well for me because of timing, but also I didn't get any points for doing it at all. So that's one way in which a problem may not help your score. The other way is that the GMAT actually discounts your highest problems. It's a way of taking out outliers. So if all of the problems you get right are at this difficulty level, and then there's one that you get right that's at a somewhat higher difficulty level, that one's discounted a bit. You still get credit for it, but it's blunted a little bit. And this is different from what we might be used to in real life. In real life, if you did some really, really difficult work, someone might look at that and say, wow, you're very capable, you're very talented, you're very smart, whatever it is. If you can do that, you can do this, right? If you can run a marathon, you can clearly run 4 miles, right? But what the GMAT is doing is saying kind of, so what to the best thing you do. They know there's a bit of chance there. You could have guessed. Um, they also know that it's only useful if you weren't sort of cheating in a sense, not really cheating, but using extra time that then would force you to let go of other things. And so the GMAT kind of reins you in on those individual questions. So a couple different reasons that you don't want to get too excited about one question. So a really interesting question in the chat: do the first 7 questions contribute more? I want to talk about that in a fair amount of detail because that is a bit of advice that tends to float around. I call it the first X questions myth. And it's the idea that you need to get the first, I've seen 5 questions, 7 questions, 10 questions, 17 questions. I've seen all these different numbers. You must get these right. Well, a couple things. First, good luck, right? Even if you're just going with the shortest version of that, get the first 5 questions right. Good luck doing it. It's very hard to do. Because the test is adaptive, the very first question may leap you up. Um, and what my charts here don't necessarily show is that sometimes those changes are very steep at the beginning. Maybe you get a mid to hard question as your first question. You get that right, and they jump you up to a very hard question to see if you can handle it. So even if it were good advice to get the first 5 or 7 or 10 questions correct, most people aren't going to be able to do it, and that includes many people who might get a 750. The other short answer is that no, you don't need to do that. Um, so let me look in a little bit more detail at the algorithm, and then we're going to talk about how many you can miss and whether it matters where those questions are missed, because there's some very interesting numbers that we've run across in looking at people's enhanced score reports, right? So we're getting used to this idea that you might get a very high score, a very low score, or somewhere in between. Your performance might be that not be that different. So these are kind of ignoring which section we're talking about. A 43 might be very exciting to you on verbal, might be less exciting to you on quant. For those who are newer to this, the sections are both scored on a 6 to 51 scale, but many of my students find that they're scoring higher in quant than in verbal. Partly this may just be their background. They're more comfortable with quant than verbal. But I find it's also just fairly common among pre-MBA students in general, that quant scores, it's very normal for them to be, say, 5+ points higher than verbal scores. However, their effect on your score, your overall score, is roughly the same. So that means that often people have more room to gain in verbal, but those gains can be harder to get. So we're going to come to that in a moment. Um, so the GMAT is basically trying to find, what is the range of questions that you can comfortably work in. And you have to kind of let this algorithm do its job. That's a very important part of this. If we get in the habit of uh, trying to force the issue, trying to get questions right that maybe we need too much time to do, or that we can't really actually do, we're trying to get in over our heads. Even if we end up doing okay and getting those questions right, the GMAT just rewards us with harder and harder questions. And so we kind of want to let it find the right balance that we can sustain for the entire exam. Yeah, asking about the wiggle room in quant and verbal. Yes, exactly. We're coming to that. So let's look at a scoring chart. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to our version of this chart. And we've put this chart in from looking at many, many exams over the years. You might look at this chart and see your score misrepresented. And what I mean by that is you might look at the chart and say, hey, I got this quant score and this verbal score, but I didn't get the score that the chart says. These are all plus or minus a box, a 10-point increment one way or the other. The GMAT comes in 10-point increments. There's no 655. Um, but these are rough ideas. There's some underlying rounding under the scores. And so this is one version of the chart. In this version of the chart, we've grayed out the scores above 46 verbal because they're so rare to see. And that's one thing we have to think about on the path to 750. We can see a big chunk of our progress grayed out. No, don't get me wrong; those scores exist. I've hit them, and some of my colleagues and students have hit them as well. But those verbal scores above 46 are much less common than quant scores above 46, and we'll see one of the reasons why in just a moment. So if you want to play with that link, you can, but I'm going to look at my version of it and highlight the theme for today, which is those 750 scores. So first thing we can see is that although there are many paths to 750 plus, they are fairly limited. One of the most common things I see, not sure I'm going to see it in this group today, but one of the most common things I see is people insisting that only their math needs improvement. Now, since I saw a lot of you telling me about your scores and your backgrounds, I'm guessing I wouldn't hear that same thing if I talk to all of you. But it's one of the most common things I hear. People will look at their scores and think that only their math needs improvement. This is partly an artifact of the percentiles that are attached to the scores. And I basically want to say, ignore those percentiles. Ignore them. Percentile tells you the percent of people that you are scoring higher than with this particular number. But because quant skills are in such greater supply on the GMAT, it's almost impossible to get a very high percentile in quant. The score of 50 on quant is only around the, what is it, 83rd percentile, whereas you hit the 99th percentile in verbal at a 45. And so it's just very different and warped. And so people will see that and think that their verbal is much better than their quant when maybe it isn't. What we can also see is that quant and verbal are more or less interchangeable. It's not precise, but they're more or less interchangeable in terms of their effect on your score. So if you looked at the extremes, you'd see that you could get a 51 quant and a 41 verbal and get a 750, Or on the other side, you might get a 51 verbal and wait a second, not a 41 quant, a 45 quant. Ah, not quite as linear as I wanted that to be, right? So one limiting thing we see there is we do need our quant to be quite high. However, verbal is going to be a crucial part of it too. And if verbal's not in the 40s, you just can't get to a 750. There's no path. At other lower scores, you can see that the slopes of those lines, like if you look through, 670 or 630, the slopes of those lines are a little bit more properly diagonal, and you'll see that quant and verbal become a bit more interchangeable. But at the highest level, you really do need to see that quant score of 45 or higher. So drum roll, right? How many can we miss? Well, the answer is, of course, it's complicated, but I'm not teasing you. I will put up some numbers. Okay. So you, if you are a steady participant on GMAT Club, you may have seen some numbers yourself. You may have some numbers. One of you put in the chat some numbers that more or less match what I'm going to show. But it's always interesting to see variation. And there's always a new enhanced score report that I haven't seen where someone gets an outlier result. So I'm going to try to show you some general trends that I've seen in terms of missed questions. So I've put along here some numbers of misses that correspond to the general area of scores that we see along the chart. So let's take a minute to process that. Check out quant. On the quant side of things, if I want to hit quant 45 or higher, I may be able to miss as many as 10 questions. And I can't guarantee that you couldn't miss more questions, but I've seen, cases where people are missing around 10, 9 questions and getting 45 or higher sometimes. As you start to climb up in quant, you start to see where you're missing down more like 6, 5, 3. You can even miss one at the very top. So I've seen perfect 51s with one missed. Again, possibly you could miss more, but that's something I've seen. On the verbal side of things, it is much tighter. It is much tighter. You're only able to miss one at the very top, and that one can knock you down pretty far. So you might miss one and get a 50, but I've seen people miss one and get knocked down to a 47. I've seen people miss two and fall all the way to a 44. So it's a very funny curve we have going here, right? If it were simply points, how many you got right, surely it would be strange to miss two and get knocked down by 7 points. But it's this weird scaled system where they knock you down pretty quickly. Interesting. So we see some outliers, and we're going to come to that. So RB says, I've gotten a 50 with 80 missed ones. I'm assuming that's on quant. Right? Yep. Someone else saying, yeah, missed one, got a 47. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, love all the comments, and people, can read through those later and see all the different data that you all are providing, which is great. There's always new data, and it's always really interesting. So I'll throw in a couple outliers, and it shows you how strange this scoring is. So I've seen people, miss 3 and get knocked down to a 49 or lower, but then I've seen also someone get a 48 missing 8. Right. I've also seen someone get a verbal 47 missing 6. So what is up with that? One person's missing 1 and getting a 47, and another person's missing 6 and getting 47. If this were being scored by a human, your first thought would probably be bias or error, right? You'd think, oh, okay, the teacher doesn't like me because, my friend missed 6 and got a score of 47, and I only missed 1 and got the same score. The teacher doesn't like me. The teacher's biased. They made a mistake, right? So some of the comments now are trending toward, okay, what accounts for this discrepancy? So love to hear a bit more about that. What makes a difference if you and I both got a verbal 47, let's say, and one of us missed 1 and the other missed 6? What would be the difference? It's not about experimental questions, because I'm talking about out of scored questions only. And that's an important note to add. When I'm presenting these numbers, I'm talking about scored questions. We don't find out how many experimental questions we missed. So what makes this difference? The difficulty level of the questions. Yeah, missing out easy questions for sure. Right. It has to do with the difficulty level of the questions. And it's really tough. You can't entirely control the difficulty level of the questions. And I don't just mean that you can't choose to get these right. And that's an important part of any discussion like this. If I say here's how many you can miss, then what? You say, okay, I'll try not to miss more than that. But how? So I want to talk quite a bit about that. Um, but you can't entirely control the difficulty because the GMAT is going to give you what it gives you. And sometimes that's complicated. So the general idea we have, and this is mostly true, is that if you keep getting questions right, the questions keep getting harder. But that's not entirely true. Because, for instance, let's say you get a reading comp passage, and that reading comp passage has um, a certain pool of questions in it. And let's say you get the first one or two right, um, and you demonstrate that you're ready for some pretty hard questions as follow ups. Does that mean that they'll give you the hardest possible question as your final question on that passage? Not necessarily. Maybe they only have a certain question left of a certain type. Maybe they hadn't yet asked you a purpose question and they wanted, the algorithm wanted to do that. And maybe you get that question, but it's a somewhat lower difficulty. So your accuracy alone is not the only thing driving the difficulty of the questions. It also has to do with what types of questions are available of each type and where those lie. The reason I bring that up is we can see anomalous cases where someone doesn't miss any and still fails to get a perfect score, which just seems unfair, right? Imagine that you see your enhanced score report and you see that you missed 0 on verbal. Congratulations, welcome to the club. It's amazing, right? And then you see that you got a 50 and not a 51. And you think, what more do I have to do? Or what if you get a 51 in quant and a 51 in verbal? Congratulations. I bow to you, right? Let's say you do that. And then let's say you get a 790 and you think, what more do they want from me? Well, there may be some underlying rounding going on there in that case. But you can't round whether you missed a question or not. Either you missed one or not. So we have seen a case where someone gets a sub perfect score, even if they got all the questions right. It basically seems that the GMAT didn't allow them to get a perfect score that day with the mix of questions it was providing. Don't fear this too much. It's only a very small edge case thing. And if you're at the point where that's your trouble, you're probably going to get into whatever business school you want, right? You probably already have a good enough score. But that's important to think about. So we're talking here about which questions you're getting incorrect. You can't skip a question on the GMAT. The only way to quote unquote skip something is to never get to it. You can't move past a question without answering. So these are missed questions. There are 31 questions in the quant section and 36 in your verbal section, a few of which will be experimental in each section, right? So we're talking about scored questions, how many are missing. So this, again, is a tricky calculus, and you can't decide for yourself what score you're going to get. But if you're like some of the people who were in the chat earlier and you're already getting maybe a 48, 49, 50 in quant, then you're missing, very few, but it depends. You may have been one of those people who missed more, but the questions you missed were harder. And the idea is that if you miss some easier ones, it knocks down your score a bit more. People were also asking about consecutive questions missed. That does matter in a sense, but a lot of that still has to do with difficulty. Because if I miss 3 in a row, what's happening? They ask me a question, I get it wrong. They knock me down a bit. Now I have an easier question. They ask me that, I miss it, they knock me down again. Now I miss this even easier question and they knock me down again. So one of the biggest problems with missing consecutives is my score doesn't have a chance to recover back up. Whereas if I miss a question and then get the easier one right, and then miss a question and get the easier one right, then my score is kind of floating around a certain level. And so that's one thing that makes a big difference. Sometimes when we see people who've missed very few, it has to do with where they missed them. Now, for instance, one of my students missed 2 verbal questions in the first quarter and 2 in the last quarter. And so they only missed 4 overall, and they got dropped all the way down to, I believe, a 42. I've certainly seen people miss more than 4 and get a 42, but they got dropped all the way down to 42. So what it seemed like happened is their score never kind of caught air, right? You imagine you're trying to fly a kite and it's just not getting up in the air. It's staying very low the entire time. And so then you might get quite a few right and you're finally getting back up there. And then in the last quarter, you drop down again. But I saw a worse case where someone got only 4 wrong and got a 40, only missing things in the second half. So it's not just about the first quarter. It's not just about the first X questions. You can do extremely well in the entire first half of the test. This person missed none in the first half of the test, but then they missed some things in the last half of the test, the second half of the test, that ended up knocking their score all the way down to a 40. So it's not as simple as get this many right in a row or get the first number right. It's true that early on in the test is one of the places, not the only place, but it's one of the places where you might see some questions that are a little lower level, that are a little maybe below your eventual level you're going to hit, because the GMAT is still figuring you out. And so if you are early on in the test and you miss those questions that are easier, that's one way to knock your score down. And I would imagine if you miss some fairly easy questions early on in the test, 750 may be off the table for you at a certain point, because you may just be at a point where your verbal score no longer can hit 41, even if your quant score is perfect. And if your quant score is not perfect, most of ours aren't, then you need to be up in the 40s. By the way, I should mention it's not an error that there's no 43 column. For some reason, the GMAT doesn't award verbal scores of 43. I don't know, maybe someone's unlucky number. I'm sure it's a function of how they're breaking up the numbers. So someone's asking, are you rewarded for a continuous streak of correct answers? And that's that same idea of correct in a row, incorrect in a row. You're rewarded in the sense that the questions are getting successively more advanced and therefore worth more. There is some analysis done relating to the idea of streaks. And so there is some complexity of the algorithm, and they don't share all of this with us. We did have one of the former psychometricians of the GMAT check out our algorithm, the one we use at MPrep, to make sure that it was roughly the same as what the GMAT is doing, and we got that seal of approval. But that doesn't mean we know all the GMAT's tricks. But my understanding is that, yes, in addition to the difficulty bumping up and down, getting a certain number in a row, right or wrong, can have an additional effect. There are other little things that happen. And little effects that can occur that shift your score a bit. One thing that I used to understand differently, and I've gotten a more precise understanding of now, is what happens if you don't finish the test. If you don't finish the test, what I used to say is there's a penalty. And it's not quite that there's a penalty, it's that the GMAT assumes that you would have missed all those questions, so you have no chance to guess any right. So imagine if I am about to finish the test and there are 5 questions remaining. If I just wildly guess, okay, I should get, A, B, C, D, E multiple choice, I should get 1 out of those 5 right on average. But even if I get them all wrong, 1 or more of them may have been experimental. But if you don't finish the test, it's going to assume you would get them all wrong, and it's going to treat none of them as experimental. And so you're going to have 5 guaranteed misses of decreasing level, and it's going to tank your score. I don't want to talk about that a lot today because that's not a 700 to 750 issue. That's a 500 to 700 level, right? In other words, you're probably not going to get to 700, very likely, if you're timing out. So one of the first things you need to do is master timing. Okay. Back up a minute to the comments. A couple of people said, how do I even know if I'm ready for the GMAT? The simplest answer to that is, are you getting a score that you'd be happy with at home? The official MBA.com tests are the most accurate tests you can take. Our Manhattan Prep ones are good too, right? But of course, number one would be to take, if you haven't already, take the official MBA.com exams. And many people will offer different versions of practice tests, and those are really good to practice with, right? So a lot of different vendors will have that, including GMAT Club, right? So you can practice with lots of practice tests, although some people overdo the number that they take. But you want to be seeing a number that you would be satisfied with at home. If the scores you're getting at home are scores that you would cancel, then don't go. just don't go unless you're going to treat it as an expensive practice test. Okay. So coming down to it then, if we want to say, how many can I miss, right? The short version, and short versions are going to lose some precision and some nuance, but the short version is you're probably going to have to miss fewer than 10 questions overall, right? If you figure at the extreme end of quant where you're getting your quant as low as possible for a 750, maybe you're missing around 10, you'd have to max out the verbal side. And if you're maxing out the verbal side, you're basically not missing any. So that would be 10. Ironically, um, a lot of people, find, hey, verbal is a lot less forgiving, and that's true. But if you're maxing out verbal or you're maxing out quant, you're very similar. You're basically not missing anything. And so probably the fewest questions you could miss would be if you max out verbal, right? If you max out quant where you're not missing anything, you still need to probably miss no more than 5 in verbal. So what am I saying, right? If I let's say I want to get a 750 by getting a 50 or 51 quant. Okay. Well, I would still need to get a 41 or 42 verbal. So I couldn't probably miss more than around 5 there. Again, these are just rough ideas. So I could miss 6 and get a 47. So it's not a perfect thing. But I couldn't probably miss 10 overall because it's very unlikely that I'll be able to miss 1 or 2 on quant and 8 in verbal and still get this. So in terms of total accuracy, I'm in some ways I can miss a few more if I'm maxing out verbal than if I'm maxing out quant. But again, we don't get to pick these things, just like we don't get to pick our strengths. And then, yeah, we're going to talk about how to max these things out a little bit in a moment. How many experimental questions are there? That's not an official thing. They're not going to tell us that exactly. The estimate I often use is 3 in quant and 6 in verbal, but I can't tell you that that is officially true. But that's the idea I get from looking at a lot of enhanced score reports. But you won't know they're experimental. There won't be any way to tell. They don't glow green or anything like that. They're just more questions. They're just basically next month's questions, so to speak. Okay. So that's our idea in terms of how many we can miss. This comes to less than 20%. In a lot of cases, it might be less. The GMAT has said that you can miss between, say, 15 and 30% of the questions to get between a 730 and a 750. But I think at the 750 level itself, it's more like 15 to 20%. Okay. So that's all very nice. How do I do it? And the silly answer that people often give to things like this is with great difficulty, right? How do I max out my quant? How do I get over a plateau? How do I get a perfect verbal score? With great difficulty, right? It's hard to do. It takes training, and I can assume as we go forward that we really are talking about getting from, say, high 600s or 700 to 750. If you're getting started, and that's fine if you're getting started, right? If you're getting started, the advice is a bit different. You have to master all the basics. You have to, learn your math foundations, and you have to learn all your grammar rules, and you have to understand, all these parts. Um, and we'll get into in other sessions. We get into those individual building blocks. I have a whole workshop just on inferences and how important inferences are for verbal. I think it's the most important skill in the entire GMAT, quant or verbal, because it's such a big part of the verbal section, the ability to make inferences. So that's my short answer. If someone says, how do I improve verbal? I say, learn everything there is to know about inferences. Get very good at those. But there's a lot more, that we want to work on. Okay. It's also very important to remember that most people don't need a 750. It's something that they would like to have. But I have some students who say, well, I'm applying to schools where the median score is around a 720, and some parts of my application are below average. So the 750 is the thing I need to put myself over the top. And if that's the case, then that may be what you need, right? So we want to see what we can do to make that happen. So let's talk a little bit about what we need to do to get this kind of accuracy. So a couple things to think about in general. Um, on quant, we talk a lot in our materials in our course about rephrasing the question. Is especially a strategy for data sufficiency, where maybe the question asks, "Is x greater than y?" But then you realize that you know what y is, and y is 20, and so you're really just saying, "Is x greater than 20?" or something like that. Maybe you're taking a word problem and turning it into algebra, and then simplifying that algebra. But even outside of a data sufficiency context, it's very important in quant that we are understanding what the question really wants from us. And that's why at the bottom I put, for both verbal and quant, probably the single most important thing you can do overall to improve your accuracy. And this might sound like I'm being sarcastic, I'm not. It's answer the question. And all I mean by that is answer the exact question that they really asked. And this is something we do with great deal of imprecision in real life. One example I sometimes use is, let's say that you asked me, "Oh, Dmitry, how was your weekend?" And I said, "Oh, it was really fun. On Thursday, we went to Boston." And what if you cut me off and said, "Thursday? That is not part of the weekend. How dare you say Thursday? I asked you about the weekend. You are wrong, sir," right? You wouldn't do that. That's not very polite, is it? But on the GMAT, if they ask you about the weekend and you talk about Thursday, the whole thing's out, right? The whole thing's out. That might sound very obvious, but my point is that often we don't even realize that we aren't answering the question that was asked. We don't even realize it. Um, and so that's a big part of getting better. Understanding the question and answering that exact question. A couple things I think about when I'm doing a quant question are, okay, first off, what do they want from me and how do I get it? So at the beginning of the question, I'm saying, all right, they want to know X, or they want to know the perimeter of this rectangle, or they want to know the greatest possible number of factors for Q, or whatever it is. How am I going to get that? And then I would like to mark down what is needed on my paper. So if they want X, I put X equals in a box. If they want Janice's age 5 years ago, then maybe I have a table of Janice now and Janice 5 years ago, and I'm boxing the J-5 part, so that I'm making sure that I don't answer the wrong question at the end, that I don't give them the wrong quantity, that I'm not off. I'm trying to catch those things. A lot of people will tell me, "Oh, I made some careless errors." Sure, we all do this. Catch them. I make careless errors too, and I don't say that I never miss a math question, right? Um, but I catch most of my careless errors. I catch most of them because I notice that the answer doesn't make sense. So another way I do this is I narrow the answers down up front. We can look at an example of this, but the idea would be, okay, I'm looking at the answer choices going, I feel like I have a ratio here, and I think the first quantity is bigger than the second quantity, so I need a fraction greater than 1. Let me get rid of everything else. Or I need something with a radical 5 in it, or I need an even number, or I need a number that's a multiple of 10. Whatever it is, this rectangle is too big to be any of these numbers. It's too small to be only D works. So I'm narrowing down the answers as much as possible. If that gets me to the answer, wonderful. And that happens occasionally. I was working with a student the other day, and they'd picked an answer that really didn't make sense. And I was trying to show them why their answer didn't make sense. I said, well, no, it can't be that large, or that, or, oh, yeah, there's only one good answer. Great. Then you can solve the whole question in 20 seconds. You won't see a lot of those when you're hitting 750, but you may see some. So another thing that you're going to do is you're going to want to review uh, 4 easier solutions. You're going to want to find an easier way to do everything. Sometimes I imagine, okay, who's someone smarter than me, whether it's just a really smart human or even, a super intelligent alien coming down to the planet. Who's someone who does this better than I do? How do they do it? If there's something that took me too long to do, maybe I can solve it, but it takes me 4 minutes. How do I solve it in GMAT timing in like 2 minutes? Or for sentence correction, maybe a minute and 20. And if I can solve it in normal timing, is there a way I can solve it even faster? So that if that's even part of a larger problem, I can still do it under GMAT timing, or so I can be fast on something, so I can afford to slow down a little bit somewhere else. I'm very pushy with my students about sticking to timing, but I do find, and maybe you've had this experience too, from my high performing quant students, people who are hitting 47 plus in quant, I do see a little bit more lumpiness of the timing, that maybe they run to more like 3 minutes here because they have another problem that they can do in 1 minute. It's still a dangerous game to play because, again, any one question is only so valuable. But I see a bit more of that specifically in quant among very high scorers. Okay, let me address some of the questions people are asking. Do you know which of the questions are experimental? No, you'll have no idea. You shouldn't try to find out. There's just no way to know. Um, for official GMAT practice questions, what percentage of hard questions should I be getting correct on the first try? I don't have a great answer for that. It's a great question. I don't have a great answer for it. Basically, um, the OG, the official guide, as we call it the OG, is not a great gauge. It's a wonderful tool. It's incredibly important to have, but it's not a great gauge for telling how you're going to do on the real GMAT, because it's very different to do individual official guide problems that are all within one difficulty band versus doing something where the difficulty is ramping up and up and up. And if you're trying to get a 750, you might end up seeing more difficult questions than you're likely to see in a stretch of the official guide. So if you're very serious about getting an extremely high score within a section, then yeah, you should be quite accurate even at the hardest difficulty level. So I would say you want to get the great majority correct even when they're hard, but you don't need to be perfect. And I've also seen people get 750 plus scores when they're guessing on, say, a quarter of the quant questions. And that might sound counterintuitive, but if you figure out, oh, a quarter of the questions is only about, what is that, 7, 8 questions, and assuming they get a few of those right, that still might only be 5 misses. Now that's assuming they don't miss anything else, which is a very large assumption. But maybe I guess on 7 and miss 5 of those, and then I miss another 5 that I didn't guess on, and I still miss 10, and I still get an okay score. So there's some variation there, but you want to be pretty accurate across the board in official guide problems. And when you miss them, you want to learn quite a bit from that. Another question was, does mastering time management always involve consciously skipping or randomly guessing some questions, right? Because skipping is randomly guessing. I would say on the quant side, for most people, it does. I still have to guess on the occasional quant question, and I've been doing this for a very long time. You may be stronger than I am in that, right? I was an English major. I love math. I teach math, but I was an English major. My dad was a literature professor. I come from a language household. And although I love math and obviously have a strength there, some of you who come from backgrounds of, maybe having graduate degrees in math and engineering, you may have a different take on how many you need to guess on. Maybe you can go through in a reasonable amount of time and get almost everything right. So not everyone has to do it, but I would say the vast majority of us do, and that includes our instructors. I have yet to hit an 800, although some of my colleagues who have said even there were a couple lucky guesses, right? So the vast majority of people are going to be guessing on quant. I don't guess on verbal at all. I do not guess on verbal. Every now and then I might have one where I say, these both seem wrong. What do I do? But I think verbal is less about guessing. That's partly a personal thing for me. Verbal is definitely a comfortable area for me. But I think in general, because verbal is less forgiving, we have less room to guess. And I think people see verbal as more of a guessing game than it is. And so one thing I try to push people is to blur the boundaries between quant and verbal a bit. So on quant, think of it as like, hey, sometimes I just go with what seems right or what I feel is the right answer. And I don't mean like in my heart, but in terms of, oh, well, the numbers couldn't be any smaller than this, or seems like that would have to be even. And I can't necessarily prove it. Whereas in verbal, I try to treat it like a math or a science. And a lot of people don't. And especially when I have students who are strong in math, I try to convince them that verbal is much more like quant than they think. I'm often telling people that data sufficiency and critical reasoning are very tightly related, in that they're both about what am I really looking for, what information is sufficient to be able to say something, and a lot of the same skills are in place there. And they both involve a lot of upfront work, and people don't realize that. Um, the question was, do some subsections hold more weight? The only difference is that you may see more of one question type than another. So we generally see maybe a bit more sentence correction than the other two, but individual questions are not, to my knowledge, weighted any differently. So it's not like, oh, you missed a reading comp, that's really bad. It just has to do with the difficulty of the question. So those were a couple things about improving quant. One other thing is watch out for too good to be true. The most common version of this that we see a lot is called the C trap. You may have heard of this. And the idea is when you're doing data sufficiency, C means that both statements together are sufficient, but only both statements together. You can't get by with just one. And people do that answer too often, right? People choose C too often. It's right just as often as any other. So I don't want to attack C. It's correct 20% of the time, just like every other letter. But people choose it when it's too good to be true. They basically say, oh, if I know statement 1, I know X. And if I plug that into statement 2, then I also know Y. So of course I can find X plus Y. But do I need both statements? That's another issue. And so that's one kind of too good to be true people pick. Another is just something where it's very simple, right? Um, so if it's the kind of answer that everyone would pick, especially at the level you're trying to hit, then that's not the answer. If it's something where I would just knock two numbers together from the question and I would immediately get the answer, it's very unlikely that that's the answer to the question. So be very suspicious of things that are too good to be true. Now, if you're just super smart and what you think of as easy is different from the rest of us, you might think, oh, well, this is so easy. I thought I was wrong. And the rest of us are sitting there going, no, that's not easy. So, you have to calibrate your ideas a little bit. But if you notice that you're picking things that most of us would have said were right and they keep being wrong, that's a trap to watch out for. On the verbal side of things, I mentioned one already, is assume that the questions are logical. So treat this like a math or a science. Right? Make prediction a standard step for critical reasoning and reading comp. In sentence correction, there's a million ways to write a sentence. We're not going to predict all the ways that it could play out. But in critical reasoning and reading comprehension, the answers are almost always predictable to a degree. It's going to vary, right? Sometimes they'll say, which of the following, if true, would weaken this conclusion? And you're going to read the argument and you're going to see the conclusion. You're going to say, oh, they're talking about profit, but they haven't adequately addressed the costs. So they're assuming that these costs won't change in this or that way. And you need an answer that's going to, maybe make the costs higher. And you can predict that very clearly in advance. Other times it might be harder. You might have a reading comp passage and it just says, which of the following wasn't mentioned in the passage? And you say, that could be anything. It's just something that was not mentioned. It could be the price of a Slurpee at 7-Eleven, or it could be, how many species of parrot there are in Thailand. I don't know what the question is going to not mention, right? But in many cases, I would say most cases in critical reasoning and reading comp, the answer is at least somewhat predictable, even if it's just noticing a pattern like, oh, they had a causal argument, so I'm looking for alternative causation. Or they're making a comparison between two things, and so I'm looking for other points of comparison that would be relevant. So that's a really important step to at least try. I also want to feel like I have a clear reason for each elimination. A lot of people, especially in sentence correction, just tell me, well, C doesn't seem right, or I don't think you can say that, or I think that means this. And if that's all you have left, then great, but that's not where you want to start. And that's not what you want to settle for when you're reviewing your work. So when you're reviewing, you want to have a reason for every single elimination that you do. Okay. And that's one of the most important bits of advice I can give for verbal. Treat it seriously. Treat it like there is a right answer and 4 wrong answers. And what makes these things wrong, and have a reason. And there's a lot of work being done on GMAT Club every day on that, where people will go through and say, here's why I got rid of B. Here's why I got rid of C. And make it less about my feeling and more about what's a rule I can lean on that's repeatable. Okay. But also be ready to be flexible. Sometimes you'll see a sentence that's written differently than you'd expect, or that solves a problem in a different way. Maybe you saw a clear, obvious flaw in an argument, but the answer choice that ends up being right addresses a smaller, different flaw, or addresses the flaw you saw in a way you weren't expecting. So we have to be ready to be flexible. But I'll reiterate here at the end that the most important thing is to make sure you know exactly what the question is asking you for, both the explicit question and the implied question. For instance, if it's sentence correction, do you know what you're looking for on a sentence correction in general? If it's data sufficiency, do you understand that you're holding out for what's sufficient, rather than simply, is this statement look like it's true or something like that? Someone's asking about frequency of practice tests. Again, it really depends on your situation, but I would say initially practice tests should be done intermittently. So if you're not taking the GMAT for several months, take one early on to get a feel, then give yourself at least a few weeks before you take another practice test. And then I don't recommend weekly practice tests until the final month before your exam. So maybe about 3 or 4 weeks in a row, you take a practice test. People who are taking them several times a week, generally are just wasting tests, especially if this isn't your full-time job. If you have a full-time job and you're busy and you're taking more than one practice test a week, then you're probably not studying very effectively. Okay. Questions about any of this part before I move on? Okay, just for kicks, let's look at a quant problem. Let me do this. Do this in here. Okay. So this is a problem. It's in the official starter kit that you get for free when you sign up on MBA.com. So you may have seen this problem before. I'm not concerned so much about solving this problem right now as about getting rid of answers that don't make sense. So if I go straight to the question, what's a units digit of a plus 2 quantity squared? Someone tell me in the chat, tell me an answer that is impossible. What's an answer that's impossible? I'm seeing A1. Why? Let me make your job easier while the rest are thinking about it. There's one answer that doesn't even make any sense as an answer at all. It doesn't even, I don't even know where it comes from. Kaushik, thank you. Yeah, 14. How can I have a units digit of 14? Someone who answers E doesn't know what a digit is, right? And that's going to get in their way, right? So 14 doesn't make any sense because it's not a digit at all. What's interesting, there's another answer that's wrong because no perfect square ends in it. And there are a lot of patterns you can see when you start to square digits, right? If I start squaring numbers, I can see, all right, if I square 0, I still get 0. If I square 1, I get 1. If I square 2, I get 4, of course. And then if I keep, cubing it, raising it to the 4th power, I have this pattern in the units digit. And every digit is going to have a pattern, right? But what's interesting is that this first set of squares tells us a lot, because any number squared is going to end in one of these, because every number, every integer, of course, decimals are another story, but every integer ends in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. And so when you square 0 or 1 or 2, you're going to get these predictable results. So what's interesting to me about that is that there's another answer that's impossible because it's not on the list. I can't have 3 because there isn't an integer in the world that I can square and have it end in 3. Why not? Because there's nothing that squared makes a 3 in the units digit. So 14 is a very odd answer because it's not even a digit. 3 is impossible because there's no square that would ever get there, right? Now, specifically, they've told us that when you square a, you get 9, which means there's only 2 possibilities of what a could be. It has to be something that ends in 3 or something that ends in 7. It may not be 3 or 7. It may be 1003 or 287, but the units digit is the only thing that will matter. So we know that a ends in 3 or 7, but then when we square one more than a, we get something that ends in 4. So we can test this. If I go 1 up the line and add 1 and then get a number that ends in 4, I square it, it ends in 6. 4 times 4 is 16. That won't do it. Whereas if I have 7, add 1 and get 8, I square it, I get something that ends in 4. So I don't know what a is, and I never will, but I know a ends in 7. So a plus 1 ends in 8, which means a plus 2 ends in 9. So actually, a is our answer, right? This ends in 1. So that's a pretty tricky question in a lot of ways. But eliminating things up front is an essential strategy, I think. So this gets to a principle one of my colleagues mentioned that I thought was really interesting. They said that people tend to be too fast to look at the answer choices in verbal and too slow to look at them in quant. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it, Because in verbal, everyone just wants to see what are the answers? What are the answers? In sentence correction, what are the splits? Some say have and some say has, or oh, okay, quickly, let me start reading. I don't have time. And that's just not a good way to proceed, right? You want to go into the answer choices of verbal knowing what you're looking for. You want to have a plan. In life, sometimes we just jump into things. Maybe you went to school not knowing what you were going to be with, or do with your life, or why you even want to be in school, or did you want to be in school, and you worked it out, and it was nice, right? But that takes time, right? Some of us switched majors a couple times before we graduated from college, and it took a little longer, right? Um, and we want to be as efficient as possible on the GMAT, right? So if you were going to be as efficient as possible with school, you'd know what you want out of school, you'd know what classes you'd want to take, you know where that was supposed to take you, and you'd go in there and you'd hit the ground running and you'd go, right? Save time, save tuition, get things moving, right? So when you have a 2-minute problem or a minute and a half problem, then you very much have to know what you're looking for. So in verbal, it's often about predicting or otherwise understanding the sentence that you're dealing with, what flaws it has. On the other side, though, with quant, we want to take advantage of the fact that it's multiple choice. And because we know that there's a lot of calculation we may be required to do, we might want to think about, are there calculations I can avoid? Sometimes, not very often, but sometimes I might say, oh, let's say A and B are too small and D and E are too large, so C is the only answer. That may happen occasionally. It won't happen that often. But this is a way of catching a lot of mistakes. I catch so many of my mistakes because I get an answer that I know doesn't make sense. But if you don't stop and say which of these answers make sense, which are possible, that's not going to happen. It also sets us up in some cases to work backwards. If I know that there are only a few answer choices that could even work, then that's that much easier to just test those answer choices rather than doing all the algebra directly. Okay. So people are asking, how do I improve accuracy for verbal if timing is a constraint, right? That is always a tricky thing, and that's why I was suggesting that upfront work is one of the main keys. It really comes down to making each of these question types more like a science, something where you say, okay, I am looking for the sentence core. I've been meaning to do a YouTube workshop, so hopefully I will do one soon on sentence core in particular, because that's something that a lot of people don't use enough of. When I'm working with a tutoring student, I train them to look specifically at, okay, subject, verb, object, cut out all the modifiers, see through the basic structure of the sentence. And that's what I think a pro sentence correction student is doing, whether they're doing it explicitly or whether they do it intuitively. They're seeing the underlying structure of the question. And the better a job you can do of doing that, the more likely it is you're going to ignore smaller splits that may or may not matter. And the more likely you are to get to what really makes something right or wrong. A lot of times when I'm talking to people in the forums on GMAT Club about sentence correction, that's where I probably do most of my work on GMAT Club. A lot of people will say, well, what about this phrase? And can you do it this way? And what if I change this phrase? And it's good work they're doing, lots of good questions they're asking. But a lot of times it's stuff that for that particular question, we don't need to decide. Because I can say, oh, well, C, D, and E all have this problem. So I didn't even have to finish reading them. And that's a big part of what we want to do is we want to feel like, okay, I know what the underlying structure of my sentence is, and I see things that I can cut out. So that we're not going to do a sentence correction problem right now in the interest of time, but that's something that we focus on a lot. And whenever I do a sentence correction workshop or when I talk to people about sentence correction, that's a big part of what I'm doing is cutting down to the core. With reading comp and critical reasoning, it's knowing what you're looking for. So if I were going to boil it down for verbal, I would say sentence core, modifiers, parallelism, the biggest things to know about. For reading comp and CR, it's inference and assumptions. If you have a strong mastery of those ideas, then in theory, there's not a question you have to miss. You just have to then, work on implementation, just like with quant. How do I make sure that I'm doing that correctly? Okay. Questions about any of that? So a question was, what about sentence correction questions that don't have splits at all? I personally don't care that much about splits. I think splits are overrated. And by splits, I mean 3 of them say have and 2 of them say has. What I'm instead worried about is, does a sentence have a valid core? What things make it wrong? And then do other answer choices repeat the problem, even if they phrase it differently? Right. So if a sentence puts a modifier in the wrong place, or conveys a nonsense meaning, or has a subject that doesn't go with the verb, it could be wrong, even if it's not wrong in the exact same way as the ones preceding it. So splits can be a nice thing if I see that three of them say have and two say has, although we can easily end up on the wrong side of that split if we're too fast. That happens all the time. And then we've already, ruled ourselves out. We've decided, well, I like has, but we haven't exactly seen why. And next thing you know, we've crossed out the right answer, and we spend all the rest of our time for nothing. So splits can be overdone. I don't emphasize them in my teaching. I emphasize much more understanding how each line works one by one. Okay. So last quick thing, I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment, put something else up. But feel free to fire away any more questions, and then we're just gonna talk a little bit about studying before we wrap up. So a couple of general principles here. Okay. So first off, get used to how the GMAT's going to work in exam conditions. You're going to be timed. Oh, sorry, this is going to pop up just a moment. You're going to be timed, so make sure that you are timing yourself. You want to make sure that you are doing time sets, not just individually timed questions. It's a bit of a artificial situation to say, okay, I have 2 minutes, let me do a problem. I have 2 minutes, let me do a problem. I have 2 minutes. Instead, once you have that feel, start doing sets of 3, 5, 6 questions. You don't need to do 10 or 20 question sets. You can just do practice tests at that point. But for a while, you want to get in the habit of doing sets of roughly 5 questions. Okay, let's see. There we go. To some extent, you want to mix the problem sets up. This depends on your goal. If I'm working on rates and work, I might do a set of just rates and work questions. And if I'm working on assumptions, I might do a set of just assumption questions. But eventually, I'm going to want to add in some problems. So maybe I'll write down some problem numbers from a study guide of things I know address a certain issue, but maybe I'll add a few things in to surprise myself. But get used to holding to that timer. One of the most common things people will tell me is they'll say, "Oh, I always take too long on these." And to which I say, just don't allow it. You've got to cut yourself off. If you practice with extra time, you're feeding yourself, something that you're not going to have on the real test day. You're relying on a crutch you're not going to have. So don't allow it. In other words, you got 5 questions for quant, give yourself 10 minutes and don't go over by even 1 second. However, follow this up with untimed practice. And this is how you get the best of both worlds, because people will say, well, I know I can get it right. I don't want to see the answer. Good. Don't see the answer. Right. So spend at least twice as long reviewing questions as doing them, building up takeaways. Often it's much more than that. I'll hear someone tell me that they took an hour to do a set of 5 questions and review them. This is totally normal. Right. Okay. So going back through and doing blind review, did I organize myself well? Was I kind of losing the thread? Was I anxious? Was I repeating? Sometimes people will write the question 3 times or write notes again. Often that's a stress response. So was I writing more than necessary? Was I repeating myself? Did I use time well? Do I think I got the answer right? And this is the idea of blind review. Don't find out whether you got the answer right until you have reviewed, and reviewed maybe pretty thoroughly. Maybe you've seen 2 or 3 ways to do the question. It should be at this point that if you were wrong, it should be quite a surprise, and it should be a real learning opportunity. Wow, I've done this sentence correction 3 different ways and I get B every single time, and the answer is E. Oh no, what's going on here? So doing that blind review is incredibly important. So what else would you do? Again, you could channel the clever alien. How would they do it? How would they be even faster and more efficient? But make sure you're doing that kind of review. Go back through everything you're doing. Once you find out that you are right or wrong, you can still learn from it, right? Do I need to redo the problem? Do I need to check the explanation to see if there's a better way, right? So you're pulling from everything. And the best way to do that is to start by not knowing if you're right or wrong. On a practice test, you'll generally be able to see right away which ones you got right and wrong. And there are quite a few in a row to do as blind reviews. So on a practice test, what I'll usually do is run through and just say, did I get this? Do I feel good about it? Okay, now let me look at the explanation. So it's sort of a hybrid between blind review and the kind of normal thing people do, which is just look over the ones they missed. In general, I think that's very bad study practice. If you're only reviewing ones you missed, you're not nearly getting enough from what you're from each of the sets that you're doing. All right. Well, that's my main advice for now. I could talk about this all day. I kind of do. But thanks everyone for coming. If you want to check out a free starter kit of our materials, you can check us out at manhattanprep.com. You can also use this code to get a discount on our complete course. I'll be around for a few minutes to answer questions. But thanks everyone again for attending. Best of luck with your journey. Sounds like some of you are well on the way. Others of you are early in the process. So happy to help wherever we can. But thanks again for coming. Someone's asking during the last month, how do I make the most of that period? I think of that as you're shifting more and more toward applying what you've already learned. So you're doing things under realistic test conditions. You're including your IR section, maybe even your essay. You're thinking about your breaks and your daily routine. When do I drink coffee? When do I wake up? When do I have my snacks? All those kinds of things. And you're doing less and less work that involves changing how you do things. Someone told me that they're taking the test in less than 12 hours. Don't change anything. Do what you normally do. If there's something that you're doing that's really hurting you that you can just drop, like, okay, I'm spending 8 minutes on a question, yeah, don't do that. But more or less, if you're going into the exam, you should be ready to just recreate what you've already been doing on your practice tests. And so it's much more about just little processes to catch more of your errors, or maybe some review to remind yourself of things you've already learned. But the closer you are to test day, the less it is about changing what you do. Whereas if you are at least a few weeks away from your GMAT, or especially if you're a few months away, you might be radically changing. You have room to get worse before you get better. I'm going to change how I do sentence correction. And first it's going to slow me down, but eventually it's going to speed me back up. Um, Other question was about a checklist. I do not have I do not have a sentence correction checklist, and I don't think anyone should have a sentence correction checklist. Checklists are death. You don't have time for it, right? It would be like if I said, what's your checklist for staying safe when you're walking down the street? Well, you don't have one, do you? But if there's something dangerous, a speeding car, a ninja, a tiger, right? Something heavy falling off a building, you get out of the way, right? You respond appropriately, hopefully. And so you don't have a checklist, and hopefully when you're walking down the street, you're not normally encountering anything terrible. But it's more about recognizing it when you see it. So what am I doing on sentence correction? I'm reading through for the sentence core and cutting things that are grammatically invalid first. Then I'm applying in modifiers and meaning and seeing, are there misplaced modifiers or meanings that don't make sense? And that's pretty much my process, right? There are a lot of little things that I've trained to notice along the way, but I don't have a checklist and I don't recommend one. Are the Manhattan Prep practice cats close to the real thing? I hope so. I think we get pretty close. I do see some students who are never able to get quite as high on hours as on the official practice or on the real thing. So I'll have students who are hitting maybe a 44 or 45 quant on hours, but are actually hitting 48 or 49 quant on official products. And that's always a pleasant surprise when it happens. I wish I could say it was always true. I wish, in other words, that I could say that our tests are just too hard all the time and you'll always do better on the real thing. But I also have people who do worse on the real thing or stay the same. So it's not as simple as that. But sometimes I think we underscore people who are very high flying. And so it can be an interesting check-in to do an official test. Oh, Vubar, thanks very much. I'll be doing a flurry of posts again soon. So tag me in anything you want me to talk about. So if you have, the question was, if I have a 48 quant, how many can I afford to miss in verbal? So you need to get your verbal in that maybe 44 range. So, I mean, the question is a handful, 2 to 4, probably. Sorry, you're saying to get 720. Oh, okay. So you can be a little bit lower, um, but not a lot, right? So let's see, 48 quant, 720 comes around a verbal 41. So unfortunately, it's not that different from what we're looking at today. Um, maybe five, hopefully fewer than that you'd miss. Would I personally recommend using LSAT for RC and CR? It's so tempting because it's such a huge resource, right? There are thousands and thousands of questions. Um, a couple important things. One, on the side of logical reasoning, which is the LSAT's version of critical reasoning, um, these questions are very hard often, but they also have some question types that you don't see on the GMAT. For instance, match the reasoning, where there's six arguments in one. They'll give you an argument, and then there's five arguments in the answer choices, and you have to see which one has the same logical structure. It's good exercise, but you'll never be asked to do that on the GMAT. The LSAT also relies on a knowledge of conditional logic. If you haven't already learned this, that might be overkill for the GMAT. Occasionally, if someone knows conditional logic, we'll discuss this on a GMAT problem, but it's pretty rare. And it's not something that I would say is central to getting better at the GMAT. So having experience as an LSAT teacher strengthened my GMAT verbal ability for sure, but it's not a practical method if you're not studying for a year or more. It's probably not a practical method to get better at GMAT verbal. Um, but if you want to kind of cherry pick out some questions that fit the same types as the GMAT, and if you wanted to avoid the conditional logic, or if you just already are comfortable with conditional logic, you can learn something there. Reading comp is just reading comp, so it's a little closer. A couple differences you'll see in LSAT reading comp. One, you'll see a lot of questions for one passage. You'll see that in the GMAT official guide too, so you could just pick a few out. Um, you also will see maybe some more straightforward questions occasionally on the LSAT. They'll just have detailed questions that are just go find it, because they have a lot of questions. They can ask you one like that. The GMAT probably won't. The other thing is the LSAT questions, because it's law school, are often centered around a central dispute of some kind, like there's side A and side B, and how do they feel about it? And although that is a structure you may encounter on the GMAT, it's not as standard. And so there are some differences. LSAT material can still be a great way to learn, but it's not something I would make central. Specific order for quant and verbal. Everyone's different on that. Most of my students, I say to do verbal first, because verbal is the section that many of them have a harder time getting a high score on. And verbal is also just more picky because you can miss so few. If you're tired, you can really fall off. Where at quant, you can afford to make some careless errors and still get a really good score. So unless verbal is your superpower, I would usually tell people to put it first. I put quant first because verbal is my superpower. Whereas with quant, I want to make sure I'm fresh and I make as few mistakes as possible. But everyone's a little different there. How long should study sessions be to avoid burnout? Generally speaking, it's going to depend on what else you have going on. When I have students who are working full time, or sometimes more than full time, I tell them to aim for about 2 hours a day. If you had a lot of time, maybe you're in between jobs and you're just focusing on the GMAT right now, you could study full time. But to me, full time would be maybe 6 or fewer hours a day with breaks. So give yourself an hour or two and get up, move around, do something else. You never have to sit for longer than the GMAT would make you sit. So if the GMAT only makes you sit for an hour, don't make yourself sit for more than an hour. But get used to endurance, because I do have some students who say, oh, after an hour and a half, I just get tired and I don't want to think anymore. So if it's going to be hard for you to take a GMAT with an hour of work and a little break, and an hour of work and a little break, start building yourself up to that endurance as well. All right, everybody. Thanks so much again for coming. I think we'll wrap things up, but hopefully this was helpful to you. If there's anything I can help with further, feel free to get in touch with all of us. And hope everyone does really well on their GMAT, obviously. So go team. Thanks, everybody.